This is your host, Michael Shermer. You're listening to The Science Salon, a series of conversations with leading scientists, scholars, and thinkers about the most important issues of our time. Hello, everybody. How we doing? Nice to see you all. Thank you so much for coming out. Just by a way of background a little bit, by the way, I have a cold, so later we'll just do the fist bumps instead of handshakes, if you don't mind. And you know, my neck has been bothering me. It's just, you know, one of those days where you get up and you go to adjust your neck and you're like that, and it's just terrible. Terrible when you... All right, let's open with a plastic cup here. Okay, don't try that at home. Anyway, so what we're doing is I started the Skeptics in 1992 with a science lecture series at Caltech. So we did that for 25 years, and then my wife Jennifer and I moved here 2.5 years ago, and I've been doing in-person salons in other locations, so I thought we might as well do one here in Santa Barbara, so I don't have to drive down to LA, which is, as you know, an unpleasant experience. My wife's first rule is never leave Santa Barbara. So, and I met Whitney at the Goleta Library when our kids were there playing, and so we put this together. So thank you for doing that, Whitney, and it's a great deal. You get for $10 you get a talk and a free magazine, and most importantly, adult beverages, which is really the only way to settle the big issues of God and free will and all that kind of stuff. I did bring enough copies of Skeptic. It is the quarterly publication of the Skeptics Society. You can subscribe online at skeptic.com, or you can fill out the form in there. It comes out every 4 weeks, every 3 months. Every issue has a particular theme. Like here was, why is there something rather than, and then nothing kind of disappears there. So we do like to tackle the big questions as well as very specific things. So we're filming this. This will be part of the podcast. I have a podcast that we release every week that gets about 50 to 100,000 views or downloads each episode. So you are coming up in a few weeks, and so that's why Brian Dalton, our videographer, you may know Brian. He is Mr. Deity, the famous Mr. Deity. So I hope to do more of these. On June 23rd, we're going to do a second one here, but instead of a talk, it's an in-conversation I'm going to have with Michael Gazzaniga. Michael is one of the world's renowned neuroscientists. He's one of the pioneers of cognitive neuroscience. And we're just going to sit up on stage and talk for however long it takes us to solve the problem of consciousness, like we have the solution, and then talk to you guys. And the idea with today and next time is it's a conversation with you. Please feel free to, you don't have to give a half-hour speech, but you don't have to just ask a 2-second question either, and that it's kind of a conversation. And so that's kind of what I'm thinking. And so I thought for today, I would just sort of do my greatest hits of, what is science and skepticism, followed by, and a little bit on why people believe weird things, which is kind of what I do. And then followed by, you can just ask me anything, or just a Q&A or a conversation. And we're going to tape all that. That'll all be posted online, both video and audio only. So the course I teach a course at Chapman University down in Orange, just 1 day a week. So I have to suffer 1 day driving through LA, called Skepticism 101, How to Think Like a Scientist. So right there, what does it mean to be a skeptic? It's nothing special. It's just a scientific way of thinking, really. We just want to know what's true, and so we often define science by what it isn't. So we think of science and pseudoscience, or science and voodoo science, or pathological science, or bad science, or non-science, or nonsense. There's a lot of that out there. And so in philosophy of science, this is called the problem of demarcation. Where do you draw the line between science and pseudoscience? This problem was first identified by Karl Popper when he was dealing with things like astrology and psychoanalysis in the 50s. And it became clear that there's not a great place to draw the line. And because it depends very much on what the claim is that's being made and who's making it. And the other problem is that no one in the history of the world has ever identified as a pseudoscientist. No one gets up and goes, I'm going down to my pseudo lab and I'm going to collect some pseudo facts to test my pseudo theory, to support my pseudo idea. Nobody thinks that. They all think they're doing, some grand thing. And I get letters from them all the time. They usually have to do with physics and cosmology. You know, Einstein was wrong, and Newton was wrong, and Hawking was wrong, and Feynman was wrong. They usually misspell their names much of the time. You know, but I've worked out, you know, the explanation of gravity or the universe or whatever, and I'll share the Nobel Prize with you if you help me get it published. It's like, I'm probably not the person to do it. You might go to the local high school physics teacher just to run by your ideas, just in case somebody's already thought of this. So in my book, so Why People Believe Weird Things was my first book. That was out in 2007. So I define science as a set of methods designed to describe and interpret observed or inferred phenomenon, past or present, aimed at building a testable body of knowledge open to rejection or confirmation. Okay, it's a big mouthful. Let me just deconstruct that. So it's a set of methods, not just one thing. It's a bunch of different things we do to describe and interpret. So we're describing nature, but we're also interpreting it because the facts never just speak for themselves. They have to be interpreted through some model, paradigm, some idea you have in your head. And you don't always observe them. They're often inferred. We don't see black holes. Well, I guess now we do see black holes, but before that picture a couple weeks ago, these were inferred. You know, you don't see quarks or whatever. They're inferred from the experiments. Past or present, because I do think archaeology, paleontology, history, geology, astronomy, cosmology, these are historical sciences. They're sciences. You can test hypotheses. And that's all we want to know. We want to know, can you somehow test it? So the shorter version is science is a method to explain the world that is testable and open to change. So there has to be some observation you can make, some way to get at it, to see if it's true or not. As Feynman said, if it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. And that simple statement is the key to science. It doesn't make any difference how beautiful your guess is, how smart you are, who made the guess, or what his name is. If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. That's all there is to it. And I think that's right. I mean, it does help if you're famous to get a hearing, at least for the first few weeks, of your idea. Here I'm thinking of the famous Cornell scientist Thomas Gold, who was correct about so many things, including the thickness of the dust on the moon and so on. Anyway, super famous guy, and in the 90s he came out with a book that oil is not a fossil fuel. It's not at all what geologists thought it was. And it's just this incredible idea. And the book was widely published, W.W. Norton, a trade publisher, and of course we got copies, and you want to promote this and so on. And so I talked to my geology friends. They're like, this guy he's out of his mind, but he's Thomas Gold, he's famous, so he got a couple of weeks. And then, okay, but this is why it's wrong. So at some point there has to be some way to get at it. Okay, so as an example of that, I'm going to tell you about a little device. Now, if you've already seen this on my TED Talk, bear with me with the repetition. But this was brought to my office in the 90s. It's a golf ball finder. And it's basically, it's a plastic handle with a little antenna that kind of rotates if you set it right. It's fairly delicately balanced here. And you'll see on the side it has a picture of a golf ball, just in case you forget what you were looking for. Anyway, when you do this and you test it, the students are surprised at how many they get right. Half. It's like, okay, we need to have a little talk about basic statistics and probabilities. You would expect to get half, but how many more than half? Like if we did this 100 times, how many more would you have to get right? Anyway, the number comes out to something like 39 above the 50-50 rate to be statistically significant at the 0.01 level and so forth. So we could reject chance as the probable explanation and say that there's something going on with this. Anyway, this thing was like $50 or $90 or something like that. The marijuana finder was $900. And then the company went out of business after the Dateline show we did on it. And they got him, I think it was mail fraud or something like that is what they got him for. But then it was picked up by a British fellow who then started selling it as a bomb detector. This is after 9/11. To security forces and police departments and military around the world, and it was selling for like $50,000 a unit. It's the same piece of, just a piece of plastic with a Radio Shack antenna kind of thing. So, and he's now in jail for many decades. He made something like $40 million selling this thing. And there's a great clip online that I showed students, who would not do it here, but where they talk about, experts called in to determine if, the mumbo jumbo he said about the quadrature and the quantum effects, and you just string together all these physics-sounding words. But you don't need any of that. You could do it with something like this, just some opaque cups. Can it do better than 50-50? That's all you need. It's a simple statistical test like that. So that's what I mean when I say there has to be some way to get at it. Is it true or not? And that's what experiment is for. Now, not everything is that super simple to test. But in general, in science, we're looking for objective knowledge. That is the basing of conclusions on external validation, as opposed to mysticism, or the basing of conclusions on personal insights that lack external validation. That is, it has to be some way that's not just my opinion. It's not just something I experienced, therefore I know it's true. As an example of this, when I was on Joe Rogan's podcast, and he's really into magic mushrooms and all this stuff, and he had me and Graham Hancock on. And Graham Hancock is one of these alternative archaeologists. He's a super interesting guy. He doesn't think aliens built the pyramids or whatever, but he thinks it was this lost ancient civilization from 20, 30, 40,000 years ago. Long before the Egyptian pyramids and so on. Okay, so he has this alternative theory he's been peddling for a long time. Anyway, it turns out he's also really into altering his consciousness through ayahuasca, which is apparently, I think, where he gets a lot of his ideas about, because he has this whole thing about, well, who were these people, the Atlanteans that built the pyramids and so on? Well, they were super advanced. Well, but Graham, there's no tools, there's no technology, there's nothing like anything we would consider to be advanced civilization, no writing, nothing from 20,000, 30,000 years ago. What do you mean by advanced? I mean spiritually advanced, like going into this other plane. Okay, so he arranged for me to be invited. I'm very likely to not do this, to go to this place in Costa Rica called Rhythmia, where you spend a whole week doing ayahuasca and going to this other place. What other place? Well, it's this other dimension that you go to. Now, you get to do yoga and you get great food and working out. All that sounds great, but you got to do the ayahuasca, which is the whole point of going to there. Now, almost everybody that's ever done this is absolutely convinced there is another world. This spiritual plane, this multidimensional, this place that you go to. Okay, how do we know that's true? The answer is take the ayahuasca and you'll see it's true. It's like, yeah, but that's still just in my head now. So I haven't actually gotten inside your head. Now I'm just altering my consciousness. So it's still internal. I don't know how you would externally validate a claim like that. And short of not being able to test it, all we can say is, well, it's probably just an internal state, because we know how neurons work and we know what hallucinogens do. It's a little bit like the problem of other minds. Like, how do I know you're sentient beings, that you're conscious? You could all be philosophical zombies, as it's called. You're all just zombies, and you act like you're conscious, but I'm actually the only one who's really conscious, and the rest of you are zombies, okay? And these philosophical head scratchers are one reason I didn't go into philosophy and I stayed in science, is because it ends up depending on what you mean by the concepts. Like, is my red the same as your red? As if the little mini-me in my head can leap out and into your skull to look on the screen to see what your red looks like and go, yeah, it looks like my red, or no, it's green in his head, or whatever. We can't solve those problems. So let's say I went and I did the ayahuasca and I came back next month or next year and set up a talk like this and said, you're not going to believe it. I went there and it is real. You got to believe me. And you'd have no reason to believe me. I mean, there's nothing like this, an experiment I can show you. And short of, we just all do ayahuasca right here in the room. Well, it is a church, so I guess it's something like a spiritual experience, something like that. So this is what I mean. I mean, if we can't get at it somehow, if it's just my opinion, my internal state. So here we get the question of what is truth. How do we know it's true? And we can make a distinction between subjective internal truths, like what I've been talking about, versus these kind of objective external truths. So here's a couple of examples of subjective internal truths. Statements. dark chocolate is better than milk chocolate.
No, it's true.
Well, now that, a lot of people are pretty convinced that one's real. Yeah. Or my other favorite, Stairway to Heaven is the greatest rock song of all time. Now, I know what you're thinking, Freebird. Freebird is great, but it's not Stairway to Heaven. Anyways. Obviously, these are just internal states or nonsensical truths, like the meaning of life is 42. Gotta love this audience. Then there are subjective truths that could become objective truths. Like if I say, well, meditation makes me feel better. That's still in that kind of realm of ayahuasca. It's like, well, this is just in my head. But so what we want to know scientifically, objectively, is it really better? Does it really make you feel better? You and me and all of us. Or, if you do meditation for 30 minutes a day under these conditions, listening to this particular thing, whatever it is, 50% of your pain, migraine will go away or whatever. Is there some kind of objective measure we can make like that? So my friend Deepak Chopra is trying to do this. He's running these clinical studies at his center in Carlsbad, where he has the Chopra Center. Now, he invited my wife and I to go there, so we went there. And I have to say, when you stay at a 5-star resort at the beach and you get massages and you do yoga and you work out and you eat great food and you meditate, you feel better. In fact, if you're not feeling better doing that, there's something wrong with you, okay? So it works in that sense, but of course what Deepak wants to know is, does it really work? All right, so he's run these experiments where he has professional meditators come in versus amateur meditators, then people like me that don't do it at all. And to see if there's kind of measurable differences in blood pressure, cardiovascular, whatever, just various genetic things. He takes, blood tests and all these, it's 100 different measures. And he's published articles saying, yeah, it really works, in some kind of measurable way. Okay, we don't need to get into that here now, but the idea is that it's making that transition from it works for me versus it actually works. There's something we can get at. Of course, that's what all of modern scientific medicine is all about, is testing it somehow. There's no such thing as alternative medicine. You know what you call alternative medicine with evidence? Medicine. Right, okay. That's right. Or other objective external truths. There are 102 people here today, let's say. Well, this is true or false by verification. You just have to count and see how many people are there. Or the dinosaurs went extinct 65 million years ago. Well, this is true by verification and replication of radiometric dating techniques. So you have a lava flow, and the radiocarbon clock starts ticking as the atoms decay, and the dinosaurs run around on top of the lava flow, and then you have another lava flow above that. So you know that however old the dinosaurs are, they're somewhere between this age of the lava flow and this age of the lava flow, and we had that down pretty well. And at some point, at 65 million years ago, as those layers they just stopped. There's no more above that. So, okay, that's it. So that's a kind of an example of a historical science that's testable, and we can say something objective about it. And of course, there's error bars. One scientist finds it's 65.1, 64.9. The little variation there does not mean, like creationists think it does, that these scientists can't get their stories straight, therefore the whole thing is bullshit. No. It's just that there's natural variations in how the studies are conducted. If they were all exactly the same, then you would expect collusion. Right down to the 6th decimal point, something like that. Or the universe began with a Big Bang. Well, this is true by convergence of evidence from a wide range of phenomena, such as the cosmic microwave background, the abundance of light elements like hydrogen and helium, the distribution of galaxies and large-scale structure of the cosmos, the redshift of most galaxies. It looks like an explosion. So there are Big Bang skeptics that say they don't believe it, but the evidence is kind of converged. So this idea of the convergence of evidence is really important in science and skepticism. At some point, you don't have to be a skeptic anymore, which gets us to what does that even mean? Are you a global warming skeptic, or are you skeptical of the global warming skeptics, which would make you a believer? And even that's a kind of a problematic statement, because it's like, I don't believe in climate change, it just is, regardless of my beliefs, which would be a little different than saying I believe in a progressive tax, and you believe in a regressive tax, and you believe in a flat tax. I would put that in a different category of truth, like, well, what's the right one? Well, there isn't a right one in the same category as a convergence of evidence toward the Earth is getting warmer, it's human cause, something like that. So these propositions are true in the sense that it would be reasonable for us to offer our provisional assent and see how it goes. It's possible evolution is wrong and the climate theory is wrong and the Big Bang is wrong. It's possible, but not very likely at this point. So, we gain confidence that way when we think about how science works. Then there's negative truths, such as the null hypothesis in science, that the non-existence of something is true. All right, so, you claim Bigfoot's real. I say, well, that's nice. Show me the body. Well, I got this video clip, and if you squint and imagine looking at this bush in the middle of the night, you can kind of see a humanoid figure. No. I mean an actual body. Because in biology, to name a new specimen, a new species, you have to have a type specimen. Here it is. You can see it, you can photograph it, you can dissect it, you can put it in your museum, so something like that. Otherwise, the default position is the null hypothesis. It's not true until you prove otherwise. So the burden of proof argument is super important for skeptics and scientists, that the burden of proof is not on me to prove there is no Bigfoot or no aliens or whatever. It's on you to claim it. So when somebody says, well, I have a cure for AIDS, I can eliminate it 100% out of the bloodstream. This hasn't been done yet, to 100%. But somebody who claims it does, we don't have an obligation to just believe them. They have to provide the clinical data and the lab tests and so forth. So, and then finally, I think it's telling that among the tens of thousands of government emails, documents, and files leaked through WikiLeaks, not one showed anything about 9/11 as an inside job, the aliens are at Roswell, or any of the other conspiracy theories and wacky ideas that people have had that claim, well, if we really saw the inside workings of what's going on, we would find out that they're true, therefore it's true. No, we just withhold judgment and just say the null hypothesis, it's not true until proven otherwise. But when you get a trove of millions of documents from the NSA and other government agencies leaked, that's a sign of the lack of evidence is evidence of lack. It's evidence of absence. It doesn't exist, very likely would not exist. I mean, if 9/11 was an inside job, there'd have to be hundreds of people, thousands of people involved. Somebody would have had a memo or a letter or something in the trove, and there's nothing like that. So that can kind of increase our confidence that this is true or this is not true, something like that. Okay. So this brings me up to Sagan's dragon, as I call it. You probably read Carl's 1996 book, The Demon Haunted World. So Carl, and he got this idea from somebody else he credits in there, but here's the thought experiment. So I have a dragon in my garage. Pretend this is my garage here behind me. And would you like to see it? Yeah, it's super cool. So I lift up the garage door and you look in there and there's just empty floor and a few paint cans, a ladder, a bicycle. Well, where's the dragon? Well, see, this is an invisible dragon. Oh, an invisible dragon, yeah. Well, we can sprinkle some powder on the floor and then when he walks around, we'll pick up his footprints. Well, you see, this dragon hovers above the ground by about 6 inches. He's a floating, hovering, invisible dragon. Well, in my best ghost-busting mode, I have my infrared cameras. We can measure the heat signature of the dragon in the garage. Well, see, this is a cold-blooded dragon. It gives off no heat at all. Well, wait, what about the fire? Oh, cold fire. It's special cold fire that the cold-blooded dragon that hovers above the ground that's invisible. And so on. In other words, at some point, what's the difference between an invisible, floating, heatless dragon and no dragon at all? Okay. So I think this has implications for many claims, including and especially religious and miracle claims. So the null hypothesis is that the claim of a miracle is not true until proven otherwise. And if your argument is simply, well, but how do you explain this amazing thing that happened? Well, there's lots of ways to explain amazing things. What do you mean by amazing? So anyway, one of my columns in Scientific American that I got a lot of mail about was, because they put it out on Easter week, the biggest miracle of all. So the resurrection is an interesting case study, because we can contrast it with, say, did Jesus exist? Now, there are these mythicists, Jesus mythicists, that think he didn't exist. And I've read their arguments, and okay, they're reasonable, but I think probably they're not good. I think somebody named Jesus probably exists. It was not that unusual of a name, and so, I mean, it's not like Jesus here in Southern California, but it was a... Okay. And that he was crucified is also not unreasonable, because the Romans crucified everybody. This was like one of their favorite things to do, and it was a big fun for the family to go out and watch the hangings in the early 20th century America. It was big fun. And then something like the proposition that Jesus died for our sins, that is in that category more like either the meaning of life is 42 or dark chocolate versus milk chocolate. How would you test that? I mean, that's just an article of faith. It's just, I just believe that. Yeah? Where's your control group? I mean, what do you mean? I mean, there's nothing like that there. Now, in between that, I think, is the resurrection. Okay, so it's not impossible that somebody really dead can come back from life, but did he? Okay, so here we bring in the famous David Hume. So I have to read just one little passage because this is the patron saint of skepticism. This is Hume's book, An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. So he defined a miracle as a violation of the law of nature, a transgression of a law of nature by a particular volition of the deity or some invisible agent. So it can't just be some super unusual event. Like, I went to the phone to call my friend Bob, and the phone rang, and it was Bob. I couldn't believe it. It was like the universe wanted us to, you hear these stories all the time. But of course, the law of large numbers, how many times did you go to the phone to call your friend Bob? He didn't call. How many times did Bob call? You weren't thinking about him, so on. You add it all up, you get certainty. Okay, so 1,000,000 to 1 odds happen hundreds of times a day in America. There's 300 million adult Americans running around doing stuff. Just highly unusual things are going to happen, and they'll be on the evening news because that's what they look for. You're never going to see next on Oprah, we have this woman that's been having these death dreams, and so far not one has come true. But stay tuned because the next one might be real. Okay, they're only going to pluck out the ones that stand out, like the person that wins the lottery can't believe he won, but somebody had to win. So a miracle can't just be that. And what most believers mean is something that, the deity intervened, reached into the world, stirred the particles in some way to cure the cancer, divert the football through the goalpost, or whatever the deity is supposed to do. So in his section on miracles, Hume gives us this sort of when all else fails argument that goes like this. In Weird Things, I elevate it to Hume's maxim. The plain consequence is, and it is a general maxim worthy of our attention, and then he quotes himself, which is clever, that no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish. When anyone tells me that he saw a dead man restored to life, I immediately consider with myself whether it be more probable that this person should either deceive or be deceived, or that the fact which he relates should really have happened. I weigh the one miracle against the other, and according to the superiority which I discover, I pronounce my decision and always reject the greater miracle. If the falsehood of his testimony would be more miraculous than the event which he relates, then and not until then can he pretend to command my belief or opinion. That's kind of a long mouthful. Basically, he's arguing that we should apportion our confidence in our beliefs to the evidence available for it. Or as Sagan famously said, or he didn't say, he made famous, there's an effect in quote mining. I don't know if you follow quotes, but the more quotes tend to rise up to the most famous person who ever said them. As Yogi Berra said, I didn't say half the things I said. Okay, it's something like that. So a guy named Marcello Truzzi, who was one of the co-founders of Skeptical Inquirer, who's the magazine preceded my magazine, he had said, that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. He had said proof, actually, and Carl changed it to evidence. But the idea is that the more extraordinary your claim, the more extraordinary the evidence has to be for it, for us to accept it. So here's just a fun example I've used before. So my wife and I live over off of Las Positas. So to get here today, I came down Portezuelo, went right on Modoc, and left on Mission, and I went up Mission. And right when I crossed Mission and State, this bright light hovered above my car, and I was abducted out of my car into the mothership up in space, and they took me to the Pleiades, where I met the Pleiadians. And they told me the whole meaning of everything and why we're here and so on. And they brought me back to the miracles of time travel, and I didn't lose any missing time, and I got here in time and so on. Okay. And then I turned right on to Santa Barbara, whatever it was. Now, most of that story, you don't need any evidence because you know the roads. It's like, well, that's pretty normal. That's an ordinary claim, but there's that one part. Wait, what happened at Mission and State? Because that's an extraordinary claim. Do I have extraordinary evidence? Well, I promise I did. I swear I did. It was unbelievable. Okay, none of that counts. It's irrelevant. And so, I didn't, next time I should grab one of the widgets on the dashboard and bring it back, or one of those probes, something that they use. Something that, matches that. So there's about 7.5 billion people alive today. How many people have lived before us, lived and died? Anybody know the answer? Because there actually is an answer somebody came up with.
50 billion?
Yeah, 100 billion. Yeah, 100 billion. I mean, it depends on how you crunch the number. It's a back of the envelope kind of calculation. If you go back about 50,000 years and you just take the kind of typical population growth averages and so on, so about 100 billion people have lived and died, and not one of them has come back, except maybe one. Okay, what are the chances? That's about as extraordinary a claim as you can get. Now, in Heavens on Earth, I deal with near-death experiences and reincarnation and all that, show why those are not extraordinary evidence at all. So, therefore, it's reasonable for us to be skeptical of the resurrection, even if we don't have to be skeptical of Jesus' existence or the crucifixion, something like that. Not to mention why he died and the theological meanings of that. Okay, what if somebody has no evidence at all? Okay, here's a cool trick I learned from Christopher Hitchens, which I then wrote a column in. I called it Hitchens' Dictum. What can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. You don't have to answer. You can just say, no thanks, or get back to me, or bye. If somebody has a crazy claim, you don't have to have an explanation for everything. Then some of my other favorite quotes from fellow skeptics, Isaac Asimov, The Relativity of Wrong is a beautiful little essay he wrote. When people thought the earth was flat, they were wrong. When people thought the earth was spherical, they were wrong. Now here he's talking about the earth as an oblate spheroid, slightly fatter on the equator than the poles and bulging a little bit more on the south end and so forth. But if you think that thinking the earth is spherical is just as wrong as thinking the earth is flat, then your view is wronger than both of them put together. And so this is the other thing about science. We make progress, our models approximating reality get better, or they don't. But there's something that we can push or pull with it, our models with evidence. As Richard Dawkins said, when two opposite points of view are expressed with equal intensity, the truth does not necessarily lie exactly halfway between them. It's possible for one side to be simply wrong. So if you have a young Earth creationist that says the Earth was created 10,000 years ago, and you have a geologist that says it's 4.6 billion years ago, the truth is not halfway between there. You don't add them up and divide by 2. Okay, it's possible some people are just wrong. And then finally, the older I get, the more I lean on this one. Sometimes people just make shit up. It's just unbelievable, the stuff people make up. They just lie. Now, I have to give credit to my friend Joe Rogan. I don't know if you listen to his podcast, but in the early days, he was a little too open-minded to some of the crazier ideas that people had, And I like to think, although he's never told me this, that I've been on the show 5 times. Maybe I've kind of given him a few tips along these lines. I now find him very skeptical of a lot of these crazy stories people tell, including this Bob Lazar character who said, "I worked at Area 51, saw the aliens myself." And so here's an interesting observation about I mentioned the line of demarcation at the start. Within fringe groups, they have their own line of demarcation. And this is really kind of amusing. Like the 9/11 truthers, they think the no-planers are crazy. Now the 9/11 truthers think the World Trade Center buildings were brought down by explosive devices, and the planes hit. The no-planers say there were no planes. Those were holograms designed by CNN and so on. The whole thing was fake. And so the truthers are like, those guys are crazy. Of course, I'm saying, well, you're crazy. It's like, which reminds me of that book, The Three Christs of Ypsilanti. Do you know this book? Ypsilanti, Michigan. There's a mental hospital there. And in the 50s, a psychiatrist got this. He had three patients, each of who thought he was Christ. So he thought, I got a great idea. I'm going to get them all in the same room together, and they'll see that they're all delusional. And what happened is, of course, each of them thought the other two were totally delusional, and they were the true Jesus. Anyway, so this gets us to the kind of the psychology of belief. Do people really believe these things? Now, I do think that people like this Bob Lazar, some people, they do just make stuff up. I don't find them particularly interesting. They're just liars. They're just lying. He said he worked at Area 51. Well, since the Freedom of Information Act has kind of opened up the doors of the place, we know that he never worked there. He worked as a contractor. I don't know what he was doing, adjusting nuts or something. Who knows? At some, not on base. And then he said he went to MIT and Caltech. He never went to either of them. You could just look those things up. But it wasn't me or us skeptics that did that. It was this guy named Stan Friedman, who's a big ufologist. Now, sadly, Stan just died last week. At age 84, and I've collided with him on CNN a bunch of times, Larry King, on UFOs, and I completely disagree with him, but he doesn't like the crazies in the UFO community because they make him look bad because he's trying to have a good story, right? Okay, so I find that rather amusing, that somebody else is doing some of that work for me. But then so just sort of wrap things up. But most people, I think, do come to believe these things for whatever reason. I mean, I mentioned no one in the history of the world ever identified as a pseudoscientist. No one in the history of the world ever joined a cult. No one joins a cult. They join a group they think is going to do something good and productive or make them wealthy or help humanity or whatever. I mean, Jim Jones was a real liberal, pioneering civil rights activist in the San Francisco area before he lost his mind and got into drugs and sexual abuse and all this crazy stuff and moved to South America. But before that, you can see pictures online of him and Jerry Brown, when Jerry Brown was originally governor of California, doing all these great things with soup kitchens and the poor in San Francisco and so on. So people join that group like, this is a good thing to help the poor and the needy. Okay, so, and that's true for pretty much every group that's out there. And most of the claims I encounter, people pretty much believe it. Now why? So, that's a whole nother lecture, but in terms of the psychology of belief, in essence, so the hard problem, as I call it, is why do smart people believe weird things? Because I give the research in why people believe weird things that intelligence and beliefs are orthogonal. That is, they're not related. So you would think intelligent, educated people are less likely to believe these sorts of things. Not true. I mean, most of the 9/11 truthers I meet, or the ufologists, or the various conspiracy theorists, these are really smart, educated people. That's not the problem. If anything, it's a bigger problem because they're really good at rationalizing beliefs they arrived at for non-smart reasons, which is to say, whatever drove you to that particular claim, your religion, your politics, your economic ideology, whatever. Most people know nothing about climate science, including me. People always send me these technical papers to read. I don't really understand. It's not my field. So I do kind of rely on the experts in the field, the people that are professionals at this, and they compete with each other and they check each other's data and so on. That's not an argument from authority, nor is it an argument from like the democracy of science. They are an elite group that compete with each other and they check each other, much like the truthers debunk the no-planers. The scientists would debunk each other if there was something there. So I can have some confidence in that, even though I don't understand it. Now, the person who says, well, I doubt climate, I'm a climate skeptic, they don't know anything about it. They're sending a social signal. It's a signaling theory. I am such a good Republican or conservative or pro-free market capitalist that I'm going to signal publicly that I deny climate. Now, it has nothing to do with the climate. It's just a political tribal thing. And that's the case with most anti-science. I think most people don't know much about it. It has secondary or tertiary links. It's a proxy for something else that they can then publicly state now on social media. This is what I believe, and they get cred with their group, right? They get more likes and retweets and so forth. So that's an interesting, kind of psychological effect there. In other words, our brains are more like lawyers than scientists. Once we commit to a belief, then we marshal all the evidence to support that particular one and ignore all the disconfirming evidence. It's the confirmation bias. Look for and find confirming evidence what you already believe and ignore the disconfirming evidence. Everybody does it. And that's fueled by your political tribes, your religious tribes, or whatever your particular ideology is associated with that particular thing, So, I mean, anti-vaxxers, I mean, what do they really know about vaccines? Really next to nothing. And if they do, they only marshal the arguments. Somebody like Robert Kennedy Jr., it's just painful to watch him make these arguments. And yet that's really not what it's about. It's about, actually the anti-vaxxer one is interesting. It's sort of an equal opportunity, left and right. Liberals fear big pharma, big medicine companies making too much money. And conservatives, this is big government telling me what I can do with my body except they don't apply that to women for some reason. So I'm just going to read just sort of the final paragraph here from Weird Things on this, and we can talk more about that if you like in the conversation here. So the last section is called Hope Springs Eternal, in which I had just finished up going through all these different psychological factors. Linking all these reasons together is the title of the final part of this book, Hope Springs Eternal. It expresses my conviction that humans are, by nature, a forward-looking species, always seeking greater levels of happiness and satisfaction. Unfortunately, the corollary is that humans are all too often willing to grasp at unrealistic promises of a better life, or to believe that a better life can only be attained by clinging to intolerance and ignorance, by lessening the lives of others. And sometimes, by focusing on a life to come, we miss what we have in this life. It is a different source of hope, but it is hope nonetheless, hope that human intelligence combined with compassion can solve our myriad problems and enhance the quality of each life. Hope that historical progress continues on its march toward greater freedoms and acceptance for all humans, and hope that reason and science, as well as love and empathy, can help us understand our universe, our world, and ourselves. Thank you.
I didn't see in your Skeptic magazine that you had addressed this Brazilian diplomatic issue where our diplomatic corps all became in Cuba.
Yeah.
But I did read today in the New York Times a very long article about what happened, the hysteria and the after effects of our Cuban diplomatic corps. Do you have any comments about that, or?
Yeah, so we have an article on that. Bartholomew is my source on that. He is a sociologist who studies mass hysteria, and he's absolutely convinced the whole sound. I forget what the right term is, but the sound attack, acoustic attacks on our embassy there were just largely a mass hysteria. Just got a little toehold, and then people started panicking. I'm not 100% convinced he's right, but I think he has a better argument than that there is this secret, attacks going on.
What I really feel as a conservative is I'm very skeptical of the unscientific claims about the solution. That's really important to point out. There's a lot of pseudoscience talking about the predictions. You can go, there's even a website. Of course, there's people that are very strident in mocking climate science, but there are so many claims daily made about there's going to be melting glaciers, growing glaciers, hotter, colder, everything else, and there's a lot of pseudoscience involved in predictions. And when you talk about these claims having to have extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof, the claim we cannot prove, and it's not testable, that we're going to be 20 feet, higher ocean, 5 years, 20 years, 30 years. I think we're all afraid that it's going to happen one of these days. What can we do about it? Well, drive an electric car. Well, I think there should be a lot more skepticism applied to these so-called solutions, because I have an electric car, I have solar panels. I'm quite aware that that's not doing anything to solve anything.
What? I thought the electricity came from the electricity ferry out of my wall into my car. Now, this is a good point. So let's steel man that instead of straw man it. So there's kind of 5 questions. Is the Earth getting warmer? What's the cause? How much warmer is it going to get? What are the consequences of the warming, and what should we do about it? So, the first 2 is what I was talking about, and I will admit that more and more conservatives have come around, say, in the last decade, to say yes, it's human cause, it's real and human cause. And then the skepticism grows of, well, how much warmer is it going to get? Well, the error bars grow the further out you go, so it's harder to predict. And of course, no one thinks, AOC's predictions of, in 12 years we're going to be, doomed or something. I don't think anybody buys that. Then then we shift from kind of the scientific question to a political or economic question. What should we do about it? And here, I'm sort of on board with Bjorn Lomborg. I think he's a pretty good skeptic on this. He starts every talk he gives with climate change is real and human cause. He's been saying that since the late 90s. And but if you apportion how much money to allocate to solve, you have, say, 25 human problems. Malaria, starvation, lack of potable water, and on and on and on. Where does climate fall in that category? Now, of course, a lot of climate scientists say, well, it should be number one. Anyway, Bjorn has this great group, the Copenhagen Consensus Group, that of economists and scientists, climate scientists, and so on. If you had $50 billion, what would you do? Well, what's the criteria? Well, say saving human lives and increasing human flourishing. Well, doing something about the climate is pretty low on the list. Mosquito nets can get you a lot of saved lives and improved lives for very cheap. Anyway, that's another way to think about it from a limited resources economics perspective.
So, hi. So I was at your wonderful 2015 Skeptics Conference down in Pasadena, and as all my friends know, it was just this incredible event. I told everybody that I know about it at Caltech. So my question is really two parts. Number one, when can we expect another wonderful 2-day conference like that, which was just amazing? And now secondly, since I know you live in Santa Barbara, can we have it here?
Yes. Well, if I was going to do another conference, it would be here for sure. Again, rule number one. Okay. So, yeah, I think probably at some place like at UCSB would be the place to do that. Those events, I've done a dozen of those since the early 90s. Those big 2-day conventions where you bring people from around. They are a huge time-consuming, expensive projects to do and exhausting. And, since I started the podcasting thing, it's like I can reach way more people. I can reach 50 to 100,000 people every week. And it's so easy to do. I just read a book. I blow down to the studio. I sit there and talk to somebody for an hour and a half, and I'm done. It's just, and so just sort of multiple approaches to, well, what's our goal? Well, we want to, teach critical thinking, science, so on, and discuss great ideas. And there's just lots of ways to do that. But at your encouragement, I will make you director of. Okay. Well, see me afterwards, and Okay, yeah.
We have another question, Michael.
I'm Michael. I'm a science teacher at Santa Barbara Middle School, and I show my students your stuff. I show them the video and the like. And the question I come up against a lot from the students, and I'm wondering if you have this same thing with collegiate students and stuff, is the students think that we're trading opinions. Now they're very, very strong, and they're just getting into their beliefs and their opinions at that time. And so I finally come to the point where I have to say, well, look, my job as a science teacher is to teach you science, not to give you my opinion about science. And so do you get that?
Sure, I get that. And it has changed. There's more of that now. I think the spread of postmodernism and this idea that there are no privileged truths, or if there are, they're based on oppression and the patriarchy and all this stuff that's kind of politicized science. The so-called science wars in the 90s has sort of come back recently, and it's just not true. Now, of course, it depends on what areas. Again, we have to pinpoint claims. If you're talking about, say, climate or cosmology or biology, whatever, it's more clear-cut. In the social sciences, it's a little messier when you're talking about, say, economic theories. Where, of course, they're not just opinions, but it's not clear what the answer is. Again, I'm going to use that example of you like a progressive tax, flat tax, or regressive tax. I'm not sure that there's a right answer to that. So
there is or is not.
There's probably not a right answer to that. Although, so like Sam Harris, I think that facts and values can overlap a lot, that most value questions can be solved with factual data. That it's just a matter of clarifying our terms and figuring out what's the right answer for most people in most places, something like that. But that's kind of obvious for some of the simpler moral dilemmas, harder for some of the other ones where there is just a lot of opinion. So I was just reminded of this. I was just reading the review in the New York Times today of Jared Diamond's new book, Upheaval, it's called. So Jared wrote this book in which he takes a model of people in crises. His wife is a crisis psychotherapist, and you've lost your job, your spouse died, whatever, something traumatic, and your life is unraveling. What do I do? And so she gives them this list. Here's what you're going to do, and we're going to work through it. And in a few weeks to a few months, they get him through the crisis, and things are back on track. So Jared then applies this to nations in crisis all over the world. A dozen different nations. Super interesting. Well, the review is just scathing. So it starts off saying, first of all, he's an old white guy, and who is he to tell, third world peoples, people of color, and women what they can and shouldn't do with their crises? It's like, whoa. And then the reviewer attacks this, Jared's idea of kind of a from 30,000 feet view of history, that there's certain models you can place on history, theories about history you can test to see whether some are better than others. This is what scientists do. He's a scientist, right? So Guns, Germs, and Steel, it starts off as a narrative history. A happened, then B happened, then C happened, then D happened. And then Jared stops and goes, now let's ask why it happened in that sequence. And if we go to this other part of the world, it didn't happen in that sequence. It happened D first, then B, then C, then A, and look what happened there. And then here's another country where they did this, this, and this, different outcome. That's what scientists do. They test hypotheses. And this review is saying history is just from the soil up. We just want to hear the voices of the oppressed. Okay. Now, those voices have a place in history, for sure. I've read The People's History of the United States. I've read The Lies My Teacher Told Me. I've read Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. All those are voices that are part of history, yes. But this idea that science is no different than just another story somebody's telling, that's a problem. Because it's not that. That's the whole point of science. It's not just my story.
Are we really discussing evolutionary adaptations? And if so, going forward, why will they not be eliminated by natural selection?
Oh, well, so one argument is that our senses are not designed, by evolution to have a perfectly accurate model of reality. They're just designed to get your genes to the next generation. So you got to survive long enough to do that. And then maybe be a parent and a grandparent, something like that. So you don't have to have a perfect model of reality. And so that's one answer. The second answer is that an accurate model of reality isn't the only thing that matters. We're a social primate species, so what other people think of me matters to me also. And so people are willing to bend their beliefs to what other people around them believe, often for good reasons. So these social psych experiments, which were basically guerrilla theater in the 60s, where you have the smoke coming into the room, or everybody in the elevator turns around and faces the back, and it's hilarity ensues as everybody kind of follows suit. But that never happens in the real world. When everybody is going in one direction, there's probably a pretty good reason they're doing that. Now, maybe they're all deluded, but probably not. Right? In our ancestral environment, it made sense to pay attention to authorities, pay attention to what everybody else is doing and what they believe. There's, this sort of, poll the audience, ask enough people, you're going to get fairly close to the right answer on simple questions. There's probably, herd mentality is not completely crazy. Okay? So a lot of what appears to be irrationalities are not that irrational in a different context. So like even the famous research by Tversky and Kahneman on type 1 and type 2 thinking and how bad we are at estimating probabilities and all that, like Danny's book Thinking Fast and Slow, it's a great compilation of all that research. But there's another German cognitive psychologist, Gert Gingerenzer, who's critical of all this, saying actually, the way you present students with these thought experiments that they have to reason their way through and then they get the wrong answer. But in a different context, that's not completely crazy. They're getting the right answer for a different context, right? So anyway, that's a second answer. So I guess I would add too, I've just finished a big project for the teaching company, great courses. I just wrote a course on conspiracies and conspiracy theories. These are different things. Conspiracies are when people actually do something. The theory is the theory about it. Okay, some of them are true, some of them are not. But what I discovered in the research is that no one really looks at, why do people believe in conspiracy theories? Well, race, age, intelligence, these different factors that psychologists look at. How about that some of them are real? So we should be at least constructively paranoid a little bit. Corporations really do lie to people about their products. This tobacco industry is a good place to start. Governments really do lie to their citizens, including ours, especially ours. So I started digging into some of the crazy stuff the CIA was doing in the 50s. I don't know if you watched Wormwood, the Netflix 6-hour documentary on Earl Morris's documentary on CIA experiments on mind control, because we were afraid of the psychic gap. The missile gap with the Russians was the psi gap. The Russians are learning to control people's minds faster than we are. We got to get in on this. Okay, well, maybe that was true, right? So they did these experiments where they gave people LSD and this kind of stuff. It's crazy. And then when Kennedy was president, his staff, all the way up to McNamara, the Joint Chiefs, presented him this document that's come to be known as the Northwood document. This came out in a trove of documents through a Freedom of Information Act related to the Kennedy assassination. We're going to find out who really killed Kennedy. Okay, I have a whole lecture on that, which could all be summed up with a little joke where a guy dies and goes to heaven, and God said, well, you had a great life. I will answer any question you want to know with the truth. He goes, all right, I want to know who really killed JFK. He said, Lee Harvey Oswald with his Carcano rifle acting alone. And the guy goes, this goes even higher than I thought. Anyway, so this Northwoods document is like all the false flag operations that we could conduct, the CIA could conduct, against Cuba and Castro, including doctoring up an American jet to look like a Russian MiG and then buzzing commercial airliners over Miami and then invading Cuba. Now, there's like 20 different of these kind of false flag operations and assassinations of Castro, like exploding cigar and all this crazy stuff. Now, Kennedy said, we can't do this. Are you insane? But the fact that our government was even thinking about doing these things, and they did do a lot of those things in South American countries to overthrow a dictator that was not as friendly to American interests as this other dictator. A lot of this stuff went on. So when a nut job like Alex Jones says, Sandy Hook was a false flag operation, 9/11 was a false flag operation, okay, they're crazy. That's not true. But they're not completely crazy, all right? Because sometimes governments do things like that. So it doesn't hurt to be, a little bit conspiratorial that way.
We have another question.
Michael, I'm a medical anthropologist, retired. And as an anthropologist, I thought it was pretty interesting and necessary for me to read in neuroscience and biogenetics and behavioral genetics. And when I talk about these things to my anthropologist and psychologist and sociologist friends, they oppose the ideas that are being presented in these disciplines.
Why?
They don't think it's true. For example, they don't think IQ is measurable, intelligence is a measurable thing. And I get a lot of pushback.
Well, I guess I would ask you that also. I mean, do you think, I'm kind of conflicted about this. It may just be the natural barriers between fields. I mean, sometimes they're literally in different buildings as a balkanization so they don't talk to each other. That's a big problem. Or is it ideological? Like, we just don't like the methods of those guys over there. We don't do that. But if they tried it, maybe it would work.
I think it's ideological.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
really do.
Yeah, we did an issue in the 90s on the anthropology wars. This was when that book, Darkness and El Dorado, came out, accusing Napoleon Chagnon of having basically doctored up and rigged the Yanomamo people to be more warlike and high in conflict so he could support his theory about mate selection and all this kind of stuff. Anyway, turns out he was right and he was exonerated, but that took years. And after that, the anthropology field kind of split between cultural and physical, where they were literally in different buildings. They weren't even talking to each other. It's like they're different fields completely. That's purely ideological. And Steve Pinker wrote this book, The Blank Slate, that I highly recommend. This blank slateism is more pervasive than any of us realized. It's everywhere. I call them cognitive creationists. That evolution only worked from the neck down. That the brain is just this blank slate. And that evolution had nothing to design in it. It's just not true. So I do think that's a problem.
Hi. So there's, as you know, there are a number of pretty negative stereotypes about non-believers. Even the word atheist looks like you're an axe murderer. And so I'm wondering, how do you stay a happy humanist instead of an angry atheist?
Well, I would just ask all of you that. I mean, I think it's just, we all just present our best face forward. Personally, I'm just by temperament more optimistic, and I'm not kind of a sour cynic. And for some reason, the words skeptic and cynic are always conflated in people's heads. So you're cynical? No, skeptical. What is that? Okay. And it's not a cynical view. We just want to know it's true. Now, in terms of defining ourselves, I don't think it's good to define ourselves just by what we don't believe. Well, what do you believe? I don't believe in God. Yeah, I know, but what do you believe? Okay, well, we believe in science and reason and logic and empiricism and love and rights and justice and freedom and liberty, and you could just rattle off all kinds of positive things, and the humanists have done this. There's numerous humanist statements, since the 30s, manifestos that have been published, and I wrote one 2 years ago, and it's sort of a positive assertion of what we do believe, which I think is pretty grand. I mean, the UN Declaration of Human Rights is pretty sound, I think, without any of the religious supernaturalism in it, and it's held up pretty well for 50 years. If you just think about how amazing that is, all those different countries that used to fight each other for centuries, sat down and agreed, okay, these are the things we think are good for humanity. Now, they didn't agree on, what's the justification of rights or whatever. You didn't have to drill down into philosophical bedrock to find some super foundation. Something like consequentialism and utilitarianism with some rights theory thrown in gave us a list of, like 50 different things that are really sound, that give us a good civil society, and I think that there's a lot to be optimistic about that way. So my book, The Moral Arc, is about that. Steve Pinker's last two books, Better Angels of Our Nature and Enlightenment Now. We're kind of carrying on this tradition that not that progress is inevitable, but that we can make it happen. In fact, it's not inevitable. It's that we have to do it, and that there's a lot of things we've been doing right. And we should figure out what it is we've been doing right and why we did that, and then do more of that. And I think we have a pretty good handle on it. In The Moral Arc, I say it's due primarily to science and reason. Now, by science, I don't mean we go to the ichthyologist for advice on moral issues. I mean the body of human knowledge accumulated over centuries that involves philosophy, humanism, empirical science, the whole package, without the supernatural religious dogma, and it works pretty good. Not perfectly, but it's the best thing we've been doing, so we do more of that. That's my argument.
So you mentioned earlier about Sam Harris, who believes that science actually can advise us on ethical principles and how to run our society, and I was intrigued that you said that it wouldn't help with tax policy, but that actually could be very important. Could you say something more about where you agree and disagree with Sam?
Oh, yeah, sure. So, let's use that example, tax policy. So we have 50 different states, so think of those as experiments. We have 50 different experiments on lots of different things. Gun control laws vary in every state, so we can look at the outcomes, and that's also pretty clear. The more guns people have, the more gun violence and homicides there are, and so on, although that's complicated, but anyway, and taxes, But there, I don't think there's, because it depends on the goal you're after. So if you say, well, we want to bring as much business to our state, and so we're going to have no income tax, and we're going to have a low business rate tax, low capital gains tax, whatever, and that's your goal, okay, fine, but then how is that going to affect the poor members of your state and so on, and is that going to gut their social programs? Well, we don't care about the social programs. Well, then there's some other state that says we care more about the social programs than we care about the business, okay? So those are all experiments. I'm not sure that you could say, well, that one's the right one. You could say, the data we collected show that if you do this, you'll get these outcomes. And if that's what you want, then that's what you should do. But if you want this other thing, okay, so Sam and I agree on the kind of the big picture, that that human flourishing, the flourishing of sentient beings, or survival and flourishing, whatever, however you want to say it. Yes, of course, that we know how to do that in the large picture, but the specifics are messier. The abortion issue is not simple. It's not simple. Often we end up with conflicting rights. The rights of the mother, the rights of the fetus, where does the fetus right start, and so on. And there I'm not sure more data will give us the answer. You give us more answers, and more data is better. So, but that's why I worry about conservatives cutting funding for research on gun violence. We need to know more about this and why it happens. There's that study that I often cite, and if you have a gun in your house, you are 22 times more likely to shoot yourself, your spouse or friend, or your friend shoots you, or your kid gets the gun, and the kid's friends get the gun, whatever, versus you shoot a bad guy. Occasionally you hear, good guy with the gun does shoot a bad guy with the gun. Okay, good, all right, fine. But 22 times more than that is, somebody innocent gets shot with the gun, or somebody loses their temper, and so on. Now that my gun proponents tell me that's a bunch of bullshit, the study was flawed, and they go on and on about it. Okay, how about we do 20 more studies so we can get to the end? Well, there's no more funding for that. Why? Well, because we don't want to know. Well, and maybe I'm straw manning the conservative argument there, but that's kind of what I know these guys pretty well. John Lott, I've debated a bunch of times. He's that guy that wrote that book, More Guns, Less Crime. Yeah, and he has this whole story that, that criminals drive around neighborhoods and they find out that everyone in this neighborhood has a gun, so they leave that neighborhood alone. Like they know this, like they're calculating this, Anyway.
As knowledge continues to advance really rapidly, and things become much more complex, the average person doesn't seem to be wired for complexity. They want simplicity, they want black and white. That means then you have to rely upon experts who are in a particular field knowledgeable about this bit of knowledge. People don't believe in experts right now. A president can tell 10,000 lies. It doesn't matter. And if you can't believe in the experts, where does that leave us?
Yep. So 2 things on that. One of the appeals of conspiracy theories is they simplify things. And that is easier for most of us. It's much preferable. A scarier answer than that the Illuminati is running the world, or gray alien lizard people in New Mexico are running the world, or whatever. No one's running the world. Like, holy shit, no one's running the world? And it's complex, it's messy, and it's like watching these experts on TV talking about the price of gas. Like, really? No one knows why? Because somebody knows. Okay, anyway, it's like that. So that's part of the appeal of the simplicity. There is this pushback against experts. I'm not 100% convinced really that's a global problem or a national problem, that more and more people are rejecting experts. My medical doctor friends tell me that it is troublesome when patients come in after consulting Dr. Google about their disease and they've got it all figured out, and who are you, a medical doctor, to tell me, and that's a concern. Some of the anti-vaxxer stuff is in that category, I would say. But to be fair, to steel man the other side, experts often do get it wrong. And they are in their own paradigms, and they're locked in, and they miss stuff. This does happen a lot, including in science. We're now going through this replication problem in most of social psychology. They just can't replicate these classic experiments. Something like 40%, have not been replicated. The stuff you see in Psych 101 textbooks that every undergraduate learns. That's a concern, and those were done by experts. Okay, so the peer review system is not perfect. It's there's so much time consumption on the part of the experts who are doing their own research. Stop what you're doing and read this 5,000-word technical paper with statistics and tell us if it's publishable. Okay, how much of that time is this person going to sit there and go, okay, I'm not going to go into my lab for 3 hours and I'm going to work on this paper, because I said I would for this journal or something like that. I'm not getting paid for it. Mm-hmm. This is the reality of peer review. This is just, and we rely on those people, and it's not always reliable. That's part of the problem.